Atlantis was from a completely lost time period.
Plato is the original source.
True. He's the original source, yes.
It's a bit of philosophy from Plato, that's all.
You can't just give the knowledge of the ancients because it can end up in the hands of the wrong kind of individuals.
The story of Atlantis is true. Atlantis' story in the 13th century BC.
We forgot all of it, an entire chapter of human civilization.
Way of Will John.
The traditional story is Solon is the first Westerner that visits Egypt in a very, very, very long time before the memory of essentially the Western world. And he visits Egypt and he goes to an island right off of Alexandria, a place that's no longer there. And there's a temple on it called the Temple of Sais, S-A-I-S. And the Temple of Sais, the entire purpose of it was to be a catalog of ancient history. And that's its purpose was a temple that recorded the ancient past. On the walls, there was the stories of our ancestors and our ancient past long before we remember it. And that was what legend has it that the actual temple contained. Now, do we have any verification on that other than that story? No. But what we know is that Solon met with a very specific elder priest named Sanchez. And Sanchez was a head elder priest of these ancient Egyptian mysteries. And according to him, he was the only one left alive that even knew the full story. He was like the elder priest of that kind of memory, and there was other priests with him. But he told Solon, you Greeks remember only one deluge, but there have been many. Primarily of water and fire, he says. And he goes on to describe different aspects. Now, what's fascinating, though, about the Atlantis story, and we get into other aspects as well, is that Solon comes back and he tells Timaeus, like a great ancestor of Plato, not Plato. Plato wasn't even around yet. But this story gets carried down with different family groups and ancestry from Solon and Socrates. It was basically a great ancestor of Socrates. And actually, Socrates was then told, and Socrates is the one who told Plato. Now, Socrates didn't believe that anything should be written down because he said it could be misinterpreted. And so what essentially happened was when Socrates was murdered and poisoned by his government, Plato took it under his wing to record and keep track of basically all the knowledge of Socrates. We only know of the knowledge of Socrates because of Plato. My opinion, John, is that the reason why Plato created all the allegories around it was primarily for two reasons. One, yes, there's a perfect example of seeing the differences between the Greek culture and the Egyptians and the idea of an empire building versus like a democracy and corruption and all those aspects. But the other thing was, what would have happened though if he didn't? I'm curious, John, during that time period, imagine your great mentor teacher, Socrates, like taught you everything you know. Imagine he's murdered right in front of you, poisoned because he's speaking out. Would you then write down the story of Atlantis in just a very literal way and be like, I'm not too worried about it, guys. Let's put this out there and see how it does? Plato would have gotten killed. Plato would have gotten murdered. So my theory here is that the reason why Plato created allegories around this was because, number one, the knowledge would have got him, he would have died from blasphemy against the church and all these different things. But also, there's this concept woven throughout history from sages and mystics, and this idea that truth is always hidden within allegory so that only those who are initiates can understand it. So there's this idea that you can't just give the knowledge of the ancients and knowledge of all of these things that make up more divine things, just you can't hand it out because it can end up in the hands of the wrong kind of individuals. And so one of the things we find throughout history, whether or not it's Hermetic texts or Mesopotamian texts, or like we're talking about right now, like Plato's text, is that they're all hidden within allegory. And it's interesting to see and wonder why they did that. And again, I think it's because it's for initiates that can understand and see and understand symbolism. Like Manly P. Hall said, once the truth and the understanding of symbolism is understood by essentially the masses, a great veil will be lifted from society because it's a way to protect a message so that only those who can understand it. Now, the interesting thing about that story, though, is that Plato says that Atlantis was destroyed, and he describes it as essentially like this time period. He says it's so many thousands of years before Solon existed, right? And I know that John knows this. If you take the numbers that they gave for like, this is how long it was destroyed before, and then you add up when Plato existed and Solon, you get this very bizarre number. You get exactly 11,600 years ago. What's fascinating about that is if you study ice cores and you study the climatic data from the Younger Dryas, you learn that at 11,600 years ago, you had the very end, the terminus, what's called the terminus of the Younger Dryas, meaning that we find the most volatility and temperature gradients, CO2, as well as climatic and disruptive Earth events at that exact date. The other thing to add on is very interesting that if you look at the descriptions of where Plato says Atlantis is, he talks about it being west of the Pillars of Hercules, in this area of the world that today very much aligns with the Azores. Now, Randall Carlson, who I've had extensive conversations about, who's a very good geologist, likes to point out that the Azores also happens to be the best example of a submerged continent that we have still today. Where if you look at a satellite image of the Azores in the Atlantic Ocean, you'll see that number one, it falls on 3 different plate boundaries. One of the most volatile areas of the world, but also it has a massive sunken plateau of land that is still relatively shallow compared to all the oceans around it. And it looks like, and geologically can speak to the idea that an actual tectonic event can subduct an entire piece of land. It can literally sink into the ocean. And we have seen that. We know that Earth's history is violent and that pieces of land, but that's from millions of years ago. I'm not confusing that with more current times. We're just simply pointing out, look, different parts of the Earth and different time periods can have disastrous tectonic effects and extreme events. Now, geologists are going to tell us that all Earth's history is based on gradualism, okay? Now, I'm a pretty well self-trained geology guy and climatologist guy who studies it for well over a decade, and I can tell you that that is true in most cases. Most of these huge events we're looking at in mountain building events did happen during a gradualism, meaning over time. However, there looks like there have been specific times in history, usually related to getting out of a glacial cycle during an interglacial cycle, when it looks like you get massive disruptions to the magnetosphere of the Earth, the poles, moving different things around, causing what I believe, based on a man named Hapgood, is called Earth crust displacement. If you think about the tectonic plates moving around, and generally they move very slowly, and you get like a little earthquake as it kind of bumps up against it, right? You get like we just had like a 5.5 here in California, kind of shook the house a little bit. You're like, woo, right? But that's nothing. Now let's imagine an actual event where the entire Earth gets disrupted based on the weight of ice on land masses, as well as coronal mass ejections and sun activity that are disrupting the magnetic poles. If you get a disruption significant enough and you start having entire movements of tectonic activity that are slipping and moving and diving under one another during these periods of time, it helps explain how you could get absolutely massive events around the Earth. Massive, to the point where you could have enough happen to completely wipe out an entire chapter of human civilization. When we're looking at the megalithic building techniques of certain civilizations, like Graham talks about, where we call them the lost civilizations, but what we find is that there's very distinctive building styles around the world that are, some of them are almost alien. And I use that not in a term saying they're built by aliens, but they seem bizarre. Some of the building styles are so perfect and so gigantic and so well done that we would sometimes or even be unable to create what they're doing today. And I mean, you look at the Great Pyramid of Giza, for example, 2.5 million stone blocks, an average of 5 to 10 tons each. But the issue there is, how would they, with the knowledge they had, be able to create something so mathematically precise based on the ratios of the Earth, the Sun, and the Moon, and being like a half hemisphere relation of our Earth? How would they know all of that if they were from an Iron or Bronze Age civilization? We're told that civilizations emerge in a gradualism way, just like geology. Nothing happens in an extreme way. Civilizations don't rise up and then disappear and then rise up again. It's literally been a slight gradualism increase from technology from 6,000 years ago when we left being nomadic hunter-gatherers, and then all of a sudden agriculture and mathematics, and we started to emerge as a civilization, and then slowly we got to where we are today. The problem with that is that there are so many structures and telltale megalithic designs that are so precise and so advanced that we have no idea how they built them, when they built them, but surely we know that a Bronze or an Iron Age culture wouldn't have the capability to build them, because we know that there was building that was done on top of them. And the building on top of them, like an example like Machu Picchu, the Inca knew how to use a type of brick and mortar with crude stones, and that's how they built all their walls. So then why do we have these highly sophisticated giant granite megalithic blocks that are seamlessly put together? And if the Inca built them, then why couldn't they build any more? Why did they all of a sudden change their building style to a primitive way? And one more example I want to give. In my work in Eastern Turkey around Lake Van, we see the same thing. Archaeologists are crediting these sites as being built by the Urartians, except I point out over and over again, why are the basis of all these temples giant basalt and andesite blocks, and then the Urartians were building with mud brick and crude stone? If they could do what they were doing below, then why didn't they ever do it again? And why didn't any culture ever do it again? So those are like what we're at, or what the questions we're asking, and it deals with Atlantis because I believe Atlantis was from a completely lost time period of our history that we forgot all of it. We forgot the sophistication of the building. We forgot, we lost our understanding of the divine concepts of the earth and the heavens and the cosmos and balance and all of these very fundamental things, and we almost became like reset.
Very skeptical, yes. Atlantis isn't real. It's a bit of philosophy from Plato, that's all.
Well, he's the original source, yes. And from then you've got embellishments, you get embellishments.
Okay, he's the original source. He's clearly taken it from someone else, though?
I can't tell whether he's taken someone else or he's made it up himself. But I think he says 9,000 years previous, there was this land. And how does lineage of people remember the actual timeline in years exactly for 9,000 years to tell him it was 9,000 years ago? To allow people like Graham Hancock, he says, oh, well, it must be Atlantis because it ties in the Younger Dryas period. There's no way a lineage of people could count 9,000 years. Yeah, between 1000 BC.
What about if you could do it through, what did the Egyptian kings have? The kings list, right? Which I know to a certain point is considered.
Oh, no, well, some kings live hundreds of years in that list.
How does that work, though? Isn't it accurate to some point, though? Can't we actually use it?
It's a guide in terms of the sequence of kings may be accurate, but maybe the years associated with them may not be as accurate. What most people don't realise is not many people really bothered about their age. You know, even 1,000 years ago, they were worried when it was summer, they was worried about when it was winter, but they didn't really worry about what age they were. They just worried that they could grow up and fight in a war.
That's a good point. The biggest hole, obviously, in the Atlantis idea, and where it's spurred on to a whole lot. Plato is the original source. And when did things start getting aliens / city under the water, everything that happened? Did it happen fairly after Plato?
I can tell you a piece of mythology that's happened in the last 100 years that has done exactly the same thing. So a man was walking through, I think it was Nevada or Arizona, and he found a piece of nuclear, it was a nuclear testing balloon. So they floated in the sky to analyse atomic bombs going off. And a bit of it crashed. And he took it home. 50 years later, we have Roswell and aliens exist. And that was a flying saucer. And we've got live aliens. And that's in an age where we have newspapers and radio and television and a better education system. And yet there are people who believe that bit of foil and stick has turned into something more. And that's how humans are. We like to embellish.
Graham Hancock, Randall Carlson, and a whole host of other people like Jimmy Corsetti and Matthew Lacroix and so many other researchers out there in the field are pushing an Atlantis date in the Younger Dryas period, and they simply do it by ignoring 41 chronographical data points that put the Atlantis story in the 13th century BC, destroyed in a Phoenix cataclysm in 1135 BC. It's perfectly there. The story of Atlantis is true. The players are all known to archaeologists. It's the Sea Peoples Federation invasions. All the players are there. The history is there, but they're all claiming that Plato is correct when he said 9,000 years before Ceylon. However, in my own research, I go into the Egyptian Sais priesthood and I show where they would never have recognized the sun as anything to trust. and that the Sais priesthood was a goddess venerating priesthood. In Sais, in the mansion of the Phoenix, at the temple of the Benben, they specifically used the moon to count time. In the ancient Egyptian systems, and I cite you would not believe, Will, how many ancient authors corrected Plato, and they have to all be ignored. This is why I have called Graham Hancock, Randall Carlson, Matt Lacroix, so many of them, Jimmy Corsetti. I've called Billy Carson, so many of these guys, I have called them out to debate this, and none of them will meet me. None of them. I have freely published all this data for the public. I'm not holding back. I give out my data for free in PDFs in my videos that you can download. And you can see the whole list of ancient authors that all said the 9,000 years was 9,000 moons. The years were 30 days each. This puts Atlantis in the 13th century BC, where it has to be. It has to be there because the whole Atlantis story is about invaders coming from the Atlantic area and attacking Athens. It has to be, because in the archaeological record we know for a fact 1345 BC, give or take a year, 1345 is the founding of Athens by Cecrops. Athens didn't exist in the Ice Age. The whole idea, it's got to be deliberate misinformation. Nobody can just make these mistakes and then not correct them.